Hi, this is Aimee
and Melissa. We are a couple of retired Texas teachers who are CALTs, Certified Academic Language Therapists. We started our own businesses, and now we have a podcast called The Dyslexia Duo.
So join us for our informative podcast, where we'll delve into dyslexia, covering the topics that affect parents, therapists, teachers, practitioners, and anyone who wants to learn more. We'll guide you through everything you need to know, from the first signs to the intricacies of dyslexia curriculum placement and beyond.
This season, we will cover the referral process, what to expect when your child or student is dyslexic, the generational impacts of dyslexia, and how to support those affected.
Come join us! Hey, Melissa.
Hey, Aimee.
Okay, so we have a very busy person with us today. She has been really hard to hammer down and get an interview with, but we all persevered, and here we are today. So will you go ahead and introduce yourself to everyone?
Great, thank you. My name is Fumiko Hoeft. I am a psychiatrist by training, so I went to medical school, and then I got my PhD in neuroscience. And I came across dyslexia, and I've been studying the neuroscience of dyslexia, among other things, since. My title is Campus Dean and Chief Administrative Officer right now at the University of Connecticut, in particular the Waterbury campus. And I am a professor of psychological sciences. It was my dream to work in a non-medical school environment once. So I have been working in a non-medical appointments in education, in neuroscience, in computer science, and also in the medical school in pediatrics and psychiatry, because all of these things, as you well know, are related to dyslexia. And I also have appointments in other places like Keio University in Tokyo, and then soon to start at Yale University and so on.
Wow. Yeah, every time I talk to you via email, you are in a different country. Every single time. Every single time.
Probably true.
So let's just kind of jump right in. So what led to your career? What got you to where you are now?
So when I was younger in elementary school, I wanted to be a physician. I wrote in my graduation book, I wanted to become a physician and help the poor and underserved people. So I wanted to go to developing countries. I went to medical school in Japan and I became a physician, but then I got fascinated by the brain. So I became a psychiatrist. And then I thought, I'm going to learn about research a little bit so that I understand how these interventions and medications and others are developed. So I came to the States many years ago, and it's been 25 years since. And starting from psychiatry to depression, I got into cross-modal integration, which is how sound and vision interacts. And I was researching that at Caltech, the California Institute of Technology. Then I sort of missed the more clinical aspect, or the real world sort of aspect. And that's when I came across dyslexia, and I moved up to Stanford in California to do research with a professor called John Gabrielli. And that's how I became fascinated and started research in dyslexia.
Amazing.
So there was no family link or anything that took you down that path or anything like that. It was just truly your own discovery in your own research through your education.
No, that's a very good question. So first, I thought it was completely independent, random, meeting this professor at Stanford, and that's how I got into it. Or that is one story. But the interesting part is that my younger son, who was born after I started dyslexia research, has dyslexia.
Oh.
So he had early signs of dyslexia. And of course, so everyone told me, just like every physician thinks that they have every disease, they thought you're labeling every child with dyslexia or ADHD or something like that. I spent years convincing my husband that, no, I know this because I know this, and I've been doing research on this. So this is one area where you can trust me. And then, but he blamed it on himself that he wasn't reading enough to the second child. And so it took me more convincing of my husband, and years of convincing, even though I saw signs, to convince him that getting interventions is not outsourcing childcare, and it's not, early intervention is important, and early assessment. So that's one kind of other connection that happened afterwards. And of course, being, as it often happens, when your child is identified, then you look back at yourself and then you realize, oh, maybe I had very similar symptoms. So I really related to my younger son because that is completely me when I was younger also. Everyone gave me an out when I was growing up because I was born in Japan, and no one still believes in dyslexia in a way, or a lot of people still don't. But also because I moved around countries. So you told me that I'm in a different country every time, but I was moving around a lot as a child also. So I came to New York, I went back to Japan, I went to London, then I came back to Japan. So everyone thought that it's an English as a second language phenomena. And they said, there's no way that you have dyslexia, you can read, you can study. And so then, but I realized that after 25 years being in the United States, people started saying, I think maybe you were right, because no one has that after 20 years of being in one country. So that's a long story again of my background and connection.
That's fascinating. So how did you convince your husband, knowing what you know about yourself, how did you convince him about your son and noticing that you see these characters?
That was the hardest part. He wouldn't listen to the scientific evidence, and he just, because he's an avid reader and it comes so naturally to him, he couldn't believe that there were people who couldn't read or didn't want to read. And so that was really challenging. I just said, it doesn't hurt. It doesn't hurt to get extra support. It's just kind of like tutoring or other things, and it's not a bad thing. And finally, we were able to convince him end of kindergarten. So it was still early on compared to most families. So we were very fortunate that way.
I do feel like that's a challenge that I go through with some of my parents, that they don't want to go through the testing process because they don't feel like, either one, that they want the label, or two, they don't feel like it's dyslexia because they can read a little bit. They can read some, so they don't feel like it's dyslexia. And like you said, they might think laziness or just that inability to make that connection because they didn't ever have that problem.
Yeah.
And I'll be honest, whenever I've had to do like IEP meetings or ARDs or anything like that, it was always the father who, it almost like I had to filibuster, and talk about all the things, the quantitative and qualitative data that I had. And it was always the dad that would go, well, I had to work that hard and I'm just fine, that type of thing. And you're like, why would you want your child to work so hard like that?
That's true. Maybe there's a link with, I often think it's very similar to, when you get lost in a unknown town and you want to go and ask for directions, and men never want to go for your ask directions. I feel like maybe there's some biological overlap there, some genetic connection there.
Yeah, definitely. I definitely feel that. So talking a little bit more about dyslexia, have you found some genetic links to dyslexia? We know it runs in families, but that's about as deep as I can go with the genetics. Is there any genetic links that you know of with dyslexia?
Yes, no, absolutely. So there are genetic links and it runs in families, but it's not very simple, as you know, because otherwise, if it's a dominant trait, then you would see it in every family member, for example, and going down the linkage in particular family members. So now we know that it's complex. So it could be called a complex disorder, polygenic inheritance, or polygenic. Poly means multiple and genic means genes. So there's multiple genes that are involved. And this, as a result, becomes more complicated. And it's not that if you have a parent, you're always going to have a child. So then the transmission is intermediate. So medium, it's not 100%, it's not 0%, it's somewhere in between, because there's multiple genes that are involved, which is called polygenic. So there are a number of dyslexia risk genes that have been identified many, many years ago. But most of the molecular geneticists, and I'm not a geneticist, but now they believe that it's much more complex. So you can't just say, oh, I discovered the dyslexia risk gene. And probably 10, 20 years ago, we saw a lot in New York Times and other places that Another a researcher found a genetic risk gene for dyslexia, and someone found one for autism and schizophrenia, and much fewer for dyslexia, and probably because of education and a lot of writing systems and different complexities make it really hard. And not as many researchers study the issue probably also. But now that it's considered more, as there's more of these common variations that you see, and many of those are involved, and each of these have really small, tiny sub% sort of effect sizes, and they combine, and then you have these 40 to 70% genetic risk if you have a close family member with dyslexia.
40 to 70%.
Probably yes, but I think, yes, and many people, and it depends on, for example, the writing system. It might depend on the family background and support system they've had, and a number of factors, and protective and resilience factors, and a number of things, which also might be biological and others, but all those are combined. And so it ranges quite widely depending on how you look at it.
Wow.
That's so fascinating. And I wonder how they found how do all the researchers, I know you're part of that, how do you guys isolate those risk genes?
Risk genes. So I'm not a geneticist. I'm not in the best place to talk about this, but so originally people did more found family transmission patterns saying, oh, you have a family member, you have a family member, you have a dad, you have a mom, and so on. And then people started studying twins, which is a very common way to study how much there's a genetic component to this. You study identical twins, you study fraternal twins, and you look at the differences, or siblings. This is about 50% overlap in genes. Identical is almost 100% overlap. So then you could do some statistics to look at the differences and see what it is. In terms of the actual biological genes, then you would take spit samples or blood samples from a large sample of individuals, and then you look at the pattern and what individuals have in their genetics unique pattern when you have identified individuals with dyslexia. So it's a power issue, and most of the earlier studies are much smaller participant sample. Even though you hear the number thousands, you think it's large, but it's not large enough to find these kind of small effects. So if they found one, sometimes and often it's hard to replicate when you do it in hundreds of thousands of individuals, which is now becoming more of the norm.
Oh, wow.
And the cost coming down also.
I can remember, it's got to be 15 years ago, I had twin girls that were both identified as dyslexic. And just because of how I had to pull them for therapy, they came at the same time. They were the same grade level, same time. I wasn't real hip on them being in the room at the same time, but it seemed to work out. But their difficulties in dyslexia were different from each other, which I thought was interesting. Of course, they both had the written expression piece, difficulty with spelling, but one was faster with decoding and sight words than the other one was. It was interesting to me.
Isn't it interesting when you look at families and siblings, you would think, even just looking at regular personalities, if you have two kids, they're never the same. One's more organized and one's disorganized, and one's happier and one's crankier maybe. And so even with dyslexia, there's so much variation. And now, just like this polygenic thing that we talked about, people often use the word multifactorial models. And so with autism and others, it is multifactorial, and that it could be biological, and many biological, genetic, and other kinds of biological impact might have, and maybe even prenatal environment might have some impact. There were old research and many people don't believe it's true, but prenatal inflammation, and there were all these things that researchers were finding and talking about many decades ago. It's a controversial topic, but there are some things that people have found in the past in autism as well as dyslexia and others. And then there's all these environmental, schooling, other effects as well that could impact. And so that all makes it complicated in terms of its expression and complex. So even if you're identical twins and sharing almost all the genes, the environment is not all completely shared, even though you live in the same home by the time you exit the home, or maybe one's more interested in something else. So It makes it very interesting and to see how different each
Mm-hmm.
child is. And it's fascinating to hear about the twin story too.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I had many a person saying, "You're missing an opportunity to write a paper."
That is true. Case study.
So, so can you share with us, with all of your vast expertise, can you share with us the definition of dyslexia as you see it with all of your research?
So dyslexia definition is, everyone knows what dyslexia sort of is. It's a challenge in reading, dys, and then lexia. So that part is easy. And then when you get to the specifics, it's very, very hard. And there's been many definitions and many groups depending on their interest or professional organization that's coming up with it. So for example, the IDEA and the 2004 reauthorization is more of an education oriented diagnosis or diagnostic or identification system. And it's been around 20 years, but I think that's mostly still what it is now. I was just reading about it and comparing it to a most recent research paper that came out last year from the Florida Center for Reading Research, FCRR, and they wrote a consensus sort of paper. They don't give you a small cheat sheet of the newest definition, but I was just reading through it the other day, and it's very interesting, and I'll point out some of the evolution. You would think that in 20 years, it would have made a major difference with all the MRI and genetic research that's been exploding. Surprisingly, you might be underwhelmed by the difference or conservativeness of the modification that's being proposed. But then there's also the DSM-4, which is the medical Bible sort of for diagnosis of neurological and psychiatric conditions. And dyslexia is not used as a label in there, but specific learning disorders is in there. And then the reading subtype will be equivalent to sort of dyslexia in a way. And they have a different agenda in terms of why they're diagnosing it certain ways, because they're aligning it with every other neurological and other biologically known cause and known non-cause disorders all mixed together. So makes it challenging. But what they said, I'll just get to some of the things that was said in this recent paper that I was just reading by Hugh Katz and his colleagues. And I think persistent difficulties in word reading, spelling, decoding, that's still there. And as expected, there is a focus on word reading. And then also that it is a neurobiological condition, neurodevelopmental condition, that's still there as well. Some of the places where they deviate is, in the previous one, they were emphasizing phonological deficits, phonological problems as a major cause of dyslexia. That is now de-emphasized, and people use the word has a multifactorial causal basis, like we just talked about, multiple things. Of course, the environment doesn't cause it, but it could make it worse. It could make it different. And so all these neurobiological, cognitive, and environmental influences impact its cause and expression of dyslexia. So that's one major change that's being proposed. And then it's also on a continuum more. And everyone knew that it's on a continuum. Some people are reading less, has some challenges, and some people have really severe challenges. So that's on a continuum. And everyone always thought so, but there is much more of an emphasis on that now, because people used to, and we still do, dichotomize, oh, you have dyslexia, you're not dyslexic. But there's a lot of this gray zone. And of course, if you're younger, it switches, because testing, as you well know, is you use a cutoff point and you look at the whole thing, but still you use a cutoff point, and it could slightly change over time. I think there's also an emphasis of context. So for example, the writing system, if you're from a Spanish speaking background or not, so those cultural backgrounds might be different. Of course, cultural background can impact whether or not the parent goes or the child will express or advocate for themselves, and that would be different also. Educational system, whether you went to a very supportive school that uses the latest intervention strategies or literacy instructions, and socioeconomic backgrounds, those could all impact on top of the biological factors. And I think the one or two final things that are emphasized in this paper that's, I think, is interesting is it happens at all intelligence levels, and people know this and say this, and research have supported this, but there's still this discrepancy. Let's look at, you have to be sufficiently or unexpected compared to other cognitive abilities. And that's in the IDEA, for example, that many people feel should be de-emphasized. And then one of the new emphasis is on the psychosocial consequences. Because if you don't get early intervention, if you, depending on your environment, there's these social emotional consequences like depression and anxiety, and these are substantial for families as well as children. I know from talking to many families that they would like to send their kids to an LD school or learning disabilities or dyslexia school because they know that they learn to advocate. They know their child is much happier and they're less anxious, for example, with a lot of peers around them. So there's a focus on the psychosocial consequences as well.
Wow.
I think that my question that came out of what you were speaking about, among other things, but what I want to kind of hone in on is you said PA was kind of de-emphasized. In my experience, when I've worked with my dyslexic students, I see a lot of times a phonological memory is more of the problem, less so of the memory seems to be a big part, but also the working memory seems to be a big component in what they struggle to overcome. I definitely see the spelling weaknesses, see the phonological component as well to some extent, but I feel like the biggest hurdle when they need to overcome their dyslexia is revolving around their working memory, having those challenges.
I absolutely agree. And look at my younger son also, that's where we first noticed. And that's what I felt like was impeding on his progress for interventions. And so I completely agree with you. And just so we know, at least in the English language, phonological processing is still a major risk factor, and the importance has not gone away. But I think the overemphasis and being like a single gene disorder, a single phonological processing creates dyslexia, that has been lessened. So what you said about memory, working memory, and these aspects, as well as other language and other systems, are very important as well.
I think that's interesting that we were talking about the phonological aspect, because I can remember years ago, and a little knowledge can be a little dangerous sometimes, that in a district that I was in, this is pretty early on, when we would do like a CTOP, and if they had average scores in the CTOP among the three subtests, the elision, blending words, and phoneme isolation, those three areas, we would stop, because phonological awareness was in place. So there must be something else going on. I mean, we know that that's the most sensitive remediation. A lot of like RTI that's out there is offered at the phonological awareness. So that might get remediated, but there's not necessarily carryover into other areas, which kind of leads me to my next question. I get a lot of like college referrals at my private practice. Can you assess this college student? Because there's a concern of stealth dyslexia. What is stealth dyslexia exactly?
So stealth dyslexia is interesting. So some people almost use it synonymously to twice exceptional or 2E students. 2E is a broader term because, of course, it's not just about dyslexia. It could be about autism and ADHD and others. But basically, you have strength in one area and then you struggle and have major challenges. So if you take that to dyslexia, then it could be talents in some area and challenges in others. But my understanding of stealth dyslexia, and it's not an official diagnosis, and it was first discussed by the EDs. And so not everyone uses, and especially in research, not many people use this term. I've used it in one of my papers, and we use it very specifically to talk about the discrepancy between reading comprehension. So typically the cascade of events would be that you have reading challenges or decoding challenges, and that could lead to whether it's not liking to read or problems with fluency, and all those kind of things could impact reading comprehension. So you would think that reading comprehension heavily correlates with decoding. Of course, most people don't think that's related to the cause of dyslexia or the main symptom in a way of dyslexia, characteristic of dyslexia, but there's a natural consequence because it starts from decoding or further up from biology. And so my definition of stealth dyslexia is reading comprehension, decoding, discrepancy. And we did a neuroimaging study several years ago, maybe almost 10 years ago now. Everything seems like several years ago, and you look back and it's like 10 years ago. So we did a study on this, and some people use the word resilient dyslexics. Maybe in the paper we use the term resilient dyslexics, but we meant that fits the stealth dyslexia category, which is reading comprehension, decoding, discrepancy. So we looked for what's the brain signature behind this, and how can we sort of predict how well they're going to do depending on their characterization or how their brain looked. So we did a study on that and followed kids for a while.
Wow. So what did you discover from that?
So the simple answer is we found that this area in the bilateral, but more on the left side, the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex, or some people call it prefrontal cortex or DLPFC, its area was important and was sort of responsible, meaning correlated heavily with this amount of discrepancy. So it wasn't correlating with decoding, it wasn't correlating with reading comprehension necessarily, and it was really correlating with the differences. And so that region is often important for executive function. And you spoke about, you mentioned working memory, but executive function, learning, these aspects, what makes human human, part of the biggest part of the human neocortex area. And that area was most related. The other interesting thing that we did was we took that part of the brain in younger kids, pre-readers, and then try to predict who was going to be most resilient also. And that area was also most predictive of who became most resilient and defined, or stealth in a way.
Okay, so I just want to make sure I'm understanding you correctly. So basically, there's a discrepancy between the way a person can decode versus the way that they can comprehend. So they might get remediation in the decoding, but still have the problem in the comprehension.
Well, stealth dyslexia is the opposite, right? So somehow they are very good at reading comprehension despite having challenges in decoding.
Okay, gotcha.
And I think that's interesting because, you know, when the kids are little, like kinder, first and second, we hear a lot of them, they're reading out loud in classes and the teachers hear them read out loud. But when they get to third grade and beyond, there's not as much reading out loud. And so I can think of, if I think back to my past, I can think of teachers going, well, he's comprehending, you know, he's understanding what he's reading, but what does it sound like when he's reading it, and how many rehearsals is he taking to get to that comprehension? I think that's something that at the secondary level that needs to be considered. I think a lot of our kids at the secondary level get missed.
I agree. And I think related to what you were saying, it's interesting because many of the quick screeners that school has implemented, and of course, with the legislation changing across the states and everyone advocating, it's changing rapidly. But a lot of the quick tests are often reading and comprehending. And then you think, okay, if you can comprehend, probably everything else underneath it is fine. But then many of these children who go unidentified, like maybe these stealth individuals, would have stumbled later in life because until maybe grade 3, you could kind of read from context or other things, and then you can't really decode and understand the structure of sentences. And when it gets to be more complex, from changing from learning to read to reading to learn, then that's where things start falling apart.
Yeah, absolutely.
So I'm thinking back to some of our conversations just a little bit earlier. I was thinking about how a dyslexic brain reads and how that differs from a non-dyslexic brain, and thinking about how you were talking about convincing family members that this person looks like they have dyslexia because of X, Y, and Z. So what would that look like if we wanted to help them compare and contrast a non-dyslexic brain versus a dyslexic brain and how it reads?
So there's a simple answer and then there's a complicated answer, but I'll start with the simple answer. So the simple answer is there's been decades of MRI research, and before that, so now There's tools like functional MRI, where you can look at the function using an MRI machine, or you can look at diffusion imaging, which allows you to look at highways, sort of white matter fiber tracks between different parts of the brain, gray matter, which is like different cities, and you can look at efficiencies. You can also use other tools like MEGs, EEGs, electroencephalogram, you might have heard of more, magnetoencephalogram, maybe less, and many other tools to look at various aspects. You can look at neurochemicals and others also. And before that, people relied on, for example, animal models, or look at lesion patients when they suddenly lost their ability to read in these rare cases, and people made observations and they were called dyslexia, for example. So that's many years ago. So you would think over the past many decades of this kind of research, and especially recently, now that anyone can go in the scan, most people can go inside the MRI machine and come out after an hour, you have a brain map and so on, that we would have a clearer picture. So the original, more optimistic understanding that you might see in a book chapter or some newspaper article will be there's several parts of the brain that's important for reading. Left hemisphere tends to be more important for language in general in most people, and that is still true. But of course, both hemispheres process language, but in different ways. And the area above the ear on the left side, I'm just doing a cartoon version, so I apologize, and a little bit towards the back, it's called it took me months when I first got into this field to understand brain parts, because this area that I'm talking about above the ear and behind the ear a little bit, a lot of people call it the left temporoparietal region. Some people might call it temporoparietal junction, TPJ, parietal temporal junction, PTJ, and then you might call it by the gyrus, which involves some of the ingulus gyrus, some of the posterior superior temporal gyrus, and then the supramarginal gyrus. So I'm just talking about this one area that people think is important for phonological processing and decoding. And people use so many words. It's part of the parietal lobe and the temporal lobe. And I got so confused, it took me months. So we start with the visualization of where it is above and behind the ear, sort of. And this area, we'll call this TPJ for now, is often important for phonological processing, decoding. There's some vocabulary possibly areas as well, and sentence comprehension, but just briefly, it's more of the phonological decoding area. That has been shown over and over again to be dysfunctional, whether the activation is lower or reduced activation, and so on. And then there's another area more towards the back and bottom of the brain that's underneath is the left occipital temporal region, OT region. And sometimes that's another one where everyone uses different words. Visual word form area, I'm sure you heard about, and that's a very specific area. Fusiform gyrus, and a lot of other different names. That one is more important, as you can imagine, as for the visual components. Mm-hmm. So it's sensitive to words more than fake words. It's sensitive to visual things. And that occipital temporal and the temporoparietal region above the ear is the one that communicates and is very important for this, what some people call the dorsal pathway. And there's all of these jargons about fiber names, but that kind of two areas have been thought to be key. And then there's a number of other areas, like you may have heard of the right hemisphere is often used as compensation. So when you're younger, the cartoon version again of it is that when you're younger, and before you learn to read, and as you're learning to read, it's bilateral. So you use both sides of the brain, and it becomes more and more heavily geared towards the left. So the seesaw kind of tips over to the left when you become a more efficient and fluent reader. And so as an inefficient reader, you might be using that right hemisphere more to support the left system. So that's one anecdote. I sort of believe that, but it's never the same region. When everyone says right, but right is a big part of your brain. It's half of your brain. And so I think it makes a big difference if it's in the front or the top or the back, and it seems to point to a lot of different areas. But the right hemisphere, we've shown that also another area that people talk about often is the inferior frontal or the frontal region. It's different from the stealth region. It's more the Broca's area or the language area, precentral area. We think it's important for articulation when they're compensating. we think it's the articulatory area. So, for example, when you're a younger child, tell me if you want me to stop because I talk a lot.
No,
This is so informative.
This is great. And I'm probably going to go back through and take more notes because I'm taking notes, but at the same time, I'm like, have to stop and process.
Yeah, I have to listen to what you're saying. Yeah.
So when you're a child, you over or covertly articulate, and I'm sure as a clinician, both of you kind of have seen this, that they're articulating or whispering sort of when they're reading. And then as an adult, normal sort of adults will lose that ability or not do that because it doesn't do much to them. And it's actually a strategy that helps kids learn to read. But then there's clinically probably, and I'd love to hear what you think, is that adults with dyslexia continue to use those articulatory strategies. So they will continue to articulate covertly or overtly. And what this imaging study, we did a couple of these to look at this, and we found that it seems like the network that's often used for compensation is in this frontal or frontal striatal sort of frontal network that's important for articulation. And that seems to make sense with their effortful strategies to articulate even as an adult with dyslexia.
Wow.
That's fascinating. I have not worked with adults with dyslexia, so I don't really have a lot of experience into that. But I do know that in my own medical journey, and I've shared this a little bit, I don't want to go into it too much, but I did have a type of stroke and it caused some damage to a parietal area, one of the cortical veins in my parietal lobe. And I do notice that sometimes words just totally change when I'm reading. And I think, is this what dyslexia is like? Is this what the kids go through? I know that it doesn't make sense in the sentence. So I go back and I see, I totally just read that word wrong. It was completely wrong. And it's because I couldn't decode it. It was just, it totally changed form. It was the strangest thing. So with that said, that's the thing I notice now when I read, sometimes I do some of that talking through, am I reading this right? You know, just making sure that I'm doing it right. So that is very interesting about the auditory component.
So when you speak of covert articulation, would that be like an adult who's moving their mouth while they read?
Yes, but it could be without even moving their mouth also. Some people talk about this internal rehearsing. So it could be a number of things, but that would be a major way of doing that also.
My father-in-law is dyslexic, so I've seen him do that when he's really trying to comprehend something like directions or something like that.
That's really fascinating.
Yeah, that's interesting.
So as far as auditory processing, I've been really fascinated by this as far as how it affects people with dyslexia. I watched another continuing education gentleman by the name of Dr. Lucker. He's a speech language pathologist by trade, but he talked about auditory processing integration disorder and how a lot of kids might have dyslexia and this auditory component, and it's more just the integration of everything all together sometimes is too much for them. So I just wanted to know a little bit more about your input on, can auditory processing and auditory processing integration disorder be intertwined with dyslexia, and can dyslexia be an integration disorder of sorts?
Oh, that's very interesting. So there's a lot of different pieces to this that I want to answer, but I will mention as a caveat, I'm not an expert in APD or auditory processing disorder. I've done in my Caltech days, my expertise was in auditory visual integration, and there seems to be a resurgence of interest in that, especially in the area of dyslexia. So I'm interested in the integration piece. I'm also interested in the auditory processing disorder piece because it does heavily overlap with dyslexia. And so all those are interesting. So I'll just say APD for now, if that's okay with you. APD or auditory processing disorder, yes, it does heavily overlap. It's thought to be about up to 50% overlap in the identification. So those with APD are likely to be identified as dyslexia. If you look at some of the tests that you use for APD, it's looking at a different level in a way. It's more like dichotic listening or some listening tests. They don't have hearing problems necessarily, but they have these complex auditory processing that then shows a difference. But it's very interesting because if you take any of those tests and look at how researchers have done research in dyslexia, often those tests have been used in research in dyslexia, and people do find differences. And it might depend on the writing system and others, but I had a postdoc from Europe once, from Leuven, and she's a professor there now, but she did a lot of work in this area of these auditory characteristics like rise time and other things that I won't go into each of the details of these measures. But what one might say is that, well, I might say something controversial, but I'll say it anyway, that it might be talking about the same thing for a lot of people, meaning that, and of course, someone will say, well, APD, 100% of those don't develop dyslexia, but as we know that it's a polygenic condition, multifactorial condition, dyslexia. So I do believe that it could be one major factor that could lead to dyslexia. So people will use the word often comorbid with dyslexia, or they might co-develop dyslexia, but it might be a stronger relationship than that, because this auditory processing, a lot of the tools that they use to diagnose APD does correlate with phonological processing. And then there's an overlap of dyslexia. Some people will say there's subtle differences and biological differences. I think there's not enough research to really look at the differences, but I do think that looking at the link between APD and dyslexia will be very helpful to understand the biological kind of mechanism underlying dyslexia. And then you brought up the integration issue.
Yes.
I think integration and auditory processing sounds like a very different thing, and they are, but mechanistically there's some overlap. And I said I used to study auditory visual integration, how sound and speech integrate. Both of this, phonological processing and auditory processing, requires very fine temporal tracking in the brain, if that makes sense, right? Because auditory signals are really rapid. And auditory visual integration requires very fine temporal timing of things, because if you miss it a little bit, so for example, have you heard of the McGurk effect?
I have not.
So if you can look up McGurk effect, there's some demos on YouTube and a lot of this. So it would be interesting for maybe we often use it for things like science outreach for kids, because you might hear one thing and you might see one thing. So if you hear a ba, I'm going to get this wrong, but hear a ba, see a pa, then you're going to process, you think you heard something else, because the visual cue is strong and the auditory cue is not strong enough, and they merge and it creates, you really think you heard something else. So it's very interesting. There's other more basic illusions that my Caltech lab, my colleague of mine, she was a postdoc there, but now she's a UCLA professor. But what she did was this auditory visual illusion where you can see a flash a number of times. So you see a flash on the screen like 2 or 3 times, say, and then you hear a clap 5 times. Then you're almost always going to say that you saw a flash 4 times, even though it's definitely giving, if you had no sound, you're never going to get it wrong and you're going to say 3 flashes. But once you hear 5 beeps to it at the same time, you're going to think that it's 4 flashes, which is very interesting. And so you can look those illusions up. But so we were studying these kind of things. I have my own illusion, but I'm not going to bore you and talk about my own illusion. It's not named after me, by the way. It wasn't that famous. So everyone was discovering these illusions and identifying the mechanism as a way to understand the brain. So that's what this lab was doing at Caltech. So getting back to auditory visual illusion, so unless the timing is perfect, you're not going to perceive that as integrate that information. So auditory visual information integration requires very fine integration or temporal sampling and parsing of information in the brain. And then auditory does as well, and that relates to phonological processing and so on. And so we proposed this hypothesis. I'm going to advertise a little bit about our hypothesis. Several years ago in 2017, now a long time ago, I guess, it's called the neuronoise hypothesis. And what we proposed was there's some individuals with dyslexia might have increased noise in the brain. Some noise is good to increase the signal detection, but if you have too much of it, then it becomes a problem. Then that creates a problem with oscillation or synchronizations between different parts of the brain, and it might increase neurochemicals that would offset some of these excitatory and inhibitory balance that is required in the brain, and that could cause timing problems, which could lead to phonological processing problems or cross-modal integrations. So that was a long way of saying I think those are very highly linked.
Noise in their brain, is that like tinnitus? Is it noise from having too much fluid in your head from needing tubes in your ears, things like that?
There's many different kinds of noise, but the one we're talking about is not related to that. It's more about at the electrical level inside the brain, from cellular and communications between different parts. So you can't really hear it. It's not audible unless you connect your cells to an amp, maybe you can. But it's about synchronization and too much noise, meaning, so if you have a fairly regular pattern of neurons spiking, for example, if you have heightened neural noise, it will be more jagged and be unpredictable. Yes, I'm not going to go too much into details because I can nerd out and talk about hours for this and get too uninteresting. So I'll leave it at that. But it's stochastic, more unpredictable kind of noisy, like you would see when you see a radio signal going zigzag and everywhere.
So then they can't focus on the thing on which they're supposed to focus their hearing.
It might relate to attention. It might relate to integration of information, because then you can't properly synchronize between different parts of the brain if you're randomly firing at random places and in a random way, if that makes sense.
A lot of sense. That's really cool. Thank you.
That is very interesting. And I'm going to have to listen to this podcast probably 3 times.
Yes.
To kind of pull it together a little bit more.
Well, you know what? We're actually hoping that we can get some continuing education credits for our association of people.
For ALTA. Yeah.
Yes, for ALTA. So
that's great.
And this is a great reason why. I mean,
great one for them to listen
so
for,
much.
For some CEs. But that's the hope. We're hoping they approve it.
And now a word from our sponsor.
Hey, Melissa.
Hey, Amy.
So let's talk about who we met at IDA, Tumbleweed.
Oh, I love Tumbleweed's decodable books, and they're for striving readers in grades 2 through 6. My favorite thing about them, in addition to the storylines, is the inclusion of comprehension, spelling, and vocabulary activities.
Yes, and there's no guessing because they took out the visual distractions. They still have illustrations, but not right next to the print.
And Tumbleweed is easy to implement with any core or intervention program. Their teacher guides are jam-packed with multimodal approaches.
Check them out at tumbleweedpublishing.com. Hi, this is Aimee Regenroth, and as part of the Dyslexia Duo podcast team and owner of Discovery Dyslexia Services, I want to talk to you about my business. Our COUT-trained team offers expert virtual or in-person therapy located in Prosper, Texas, using proven dyslexia curricula like Take Flight, Build, MTA, Alphabetic Phonics, and Reading by Design. We also provide crucial independent evaluations and advocacy services. Don't wait. Empower your child today. Visit www.discovereed.com to learn more. That again is www.discoveread.com. Discovereed, covering all your dyslexia needs. Let's return to the show. So we're going to go to the basics, I guess, and talk about the identification of dyslexia. So starting at the first here, how is dyslexia identified? And then I hear parents still going, well, I'm taking them to the pediatrician or I'm taking them to the hospital. What do you see as the difference between a medical identification and an educational identification?
So I would strongly recommend getting identified. I know I'm an MD, so I can say this, but not going to an MD and going to an educational learning specialist psychologist to get identified. My older one has ADHD, my younger one has dyslexia. And I think I have both, but an older one, for example, if you're thinking about, I mean, even if you're not thinking about long-term high-stake tests and applying for college and so on, but learning specialist diagnosis carries much more weight. It's probably because psychiatrists don't assess the child for 6, 7, 8 hours and do detailed language tests, do detailed IQ tests and so on, or memory tests. And often it relies on those reports, but then it asks mostly about how you're doing in school, and it's counting on a lot of reports from the families, individuals, and the schools. So they do questionnaires and others, but it's often a self-report or parent report or teacher report. And so they are very important for prescribing medication if your child has ADHD on top of it, because if you look at the detailed meta-analysis, systematic reviews, decades, there's a number of great ones, and I did a whole search on this a while ago. But if you look at that, when you have overlap, it doesn't matter. I mean, people care about, and researchers care about the genetic and biological overlap, but it doesn't matter what it's coming from it. And it doesn't matter if you have ADHD and that leads to reading problem. It doesn't matter if you have dyslexia leading to attention problems because you don't want to focus in class and you want to be the clown. You do want to address each of them separately. And to do that, sure, ADHD is more often in the territory of physicians. They prescribe meds. It's considered more of a neuropsychiatric thing. So then most people go to a psychiatrist. So you don't have to go to a clinical psychologist for that one. But for dyslexia, because they are the one that does all these key assessments and spend hours, I do really think that it is, even if someone says it's quicker if you go to a psychiatrist or a child psychiatrist, I think it's good if you can make the time to go to see a psychologist for sure.
Okay, that's great information. So what if a parent, thinks that their child might have dyslexia, and knowing now it's probably best to go to the teacher? What information should the parent bring with them about their child when they're talking to the teacher, when they're talking to the diagnostician about their concerns about their child and dyslexia?
I think the most important thing, if your child is in public schools, is to put it in writing. Of course, you should always talk to the teachers, but make sure you put it in writing and send an email or documentation, because that's when the legal aspects kick in, that the schools do have the responsibility to address this, form a team, and assess the child within a certain amount of days. So I think that's important. And it depends on what information you bring to the school. I think if the school, and most schools would do a great job in assessing and getting the necessary psychologist or educational psychologist, clinical psychologist to do the assessment, I think family history could be important. So family history, if there's some other family members who struggled, Connecticut, for example, we just created a brief parent history questionnaire that we validated and published a couple years ago. And so Connecticut is thinking about using that because it's only 6 questions and it has a certain amount of predictability, not just to assess whether the parent had a problem, but mostly to identify if the child is at this biological genetics sort of risk for developing reading problems. But so family history, saying that it runs in the family, that, and to get the teacher's attention is probably a good thing. I'm sure they will ask these questions, but language spoken at home, the environment, explaining that will be important. Other kind of issues, whether they have attention or other development of stuttering, or if they had to get a language speech therapist, those kind of things would be important. But most importantly, start a conversation, documenting any concern in writing.
Perfect. Thank you.
Okay, so I have another question for you about kind of going back a little bit to working memory, just so I can get this off of my mind, because I'm really fascinated by working memory. What strategies would you suggest people use to improve their working memory, or for me to help my students with their working memory challenges?
I would, number one, want to do it myself if I knew a good one and an easy one. Number two, probably it could be a good question for ChatGPT. So I don't really know what the good interventions would be.
I know that we had talked to Dr. Dean, who's a psychologist, and he had said, that there's different games that you can play where you're having to hold information in your memory and then do something with it, and then get some more information and do something with that, and then come back to the other information. It sounded very confusing, but
that sounds good.
Yeah, he had because I kind of approached it with, I didn't think you personally, like an educator, could improve working memory. It was just something, maybe maturity over time. And he's like, no, you can do things to improve your working memory. So that was mind-blowing for me when I heard that.
One thing to be careful, and I'm not talking about this one that was recommended by Dr. Dean, but in general, I think one thing to be careful is, as a parent, we wrote an article, Devin Kearns and myself wrote an article about how to look for interventions that are evidence-based.
Mm-hmm.
And we have these cartoons saying, the publisher says, we did research on this and it works 100% of the time, whether you should trust that versus whether you can trust it if a third-party researchers did research on it and not connected to money and other things. And then we have some resources on some of these clearinghouses and databases that you can look at. And we wrote this several years ago, probably. But I think really looking at whether or not who did the research and whether you can trust that research, even if it says brain-based or evidence-based, it's been proven. Really trying to find that information is important. And there's particular numbers that districts and states will use to approve some of these. And even then it's tricky. And then the other thing is, even if it works for that skill that you're training on, if you did a test on, or if you did training in some visual domain, whether that translates to more broadly to reading or auditory domain, that transfer and generalizability is a very different and challenging one. And that's where a lot of these working memory games have been criticized, especially EdTech type apps that claims to work on working memory.
That's good to know and good to keep in the back of my mind, because I will be continuing to research that. So thank you for pointing that out. It kind of makes me think about when I see posts about people who say that they can remediate dyslexia and your child can grow 4 reading levels in just 6 months. And I'm like,
without saying the company. Yeah.
Yeah. And I'm thinking, that's not really how that works, but
yeah. No, I get that too. So I've been doing dyslexia education since 92 in some way, either as a teacher or as a therapist or as a qualified instructor. And I can remember when I first started back in the mid-90s, we wouldn't identify students with dyslexia until 3rd grade. But now we know that it's important that the sooner the better, right? The earlier the better. I have a friend that made a post the other day, and she talked about all the early intervention her child received up until she started getting dyslexia therapy. And she said now grades are great. She does wonderful. Very few accommodations are needed in school. So she's like, that's an example of why we provide early identification. So in your professional life, explain to our audience why early identification is crucial and how can we promote early identification of dyslexia?
So early identification is important for many reasons. The first one is that you might never have to have a formal diagnosis of dyslexia. And if you look at the brain scans before they start to read, and if you look at those kids with risk, for example, children with family members with dyslexia, and you scan them before they're reading, and Nadine Gabb did this, we did this, many others, we did a meta-analysis of this, and there's neurosignatures are there already, which means that it's cooking in a way. It's there. So if we can address those with some sensitive behavioral tests or others and address them early, it's a good thing. They're either not going to be identified as dyslexic, perhaps, or their symptoms or challenges are going to be much less severe. The other benefit from that is if you're doing intervention, it's going to be much less costly. So it might be a group intervention, even after school or within the classroom with the teachers, trained teachers, and small group interventions might be effective, except for if you wait, it's not that it's not going to be effective, but you might require daily interventions for an hour or 2 hours. So that will be the difference you'll be looking at, depending on whether you start in kindergarten or you wait, or first grade, or you wait until you're in fifth, sixth, seventh grade. I think the other positive is the social emotional consequences. So my younger son, for example, every day almost after school, he will talk about how this is pre-K and kindergarten. Some kids were reading, some kids had Harry Potter books in their hand at that young age. And some kids will know to read simple sentences or words, and our son wouldn't or couldn't. And he would come home and say that he was the dumbest kid in the class. He'd be in tears. Every Sunday was a tragedy because he would be crying and he didn't see the value in schools. And then when he graduated from reading interventions, by the time he was in third grade, he was able to finish the Slingo that he was doing, which was great because a lot of people will be identified at that time and then getting interventions. And so that had a really positive impact. Instead of working on having your self-esteem hurt and getting worse and worse, and growth mindset changing to fixed mindset over time, and then finally getting interventions, then your confidence going up, then it was, I wouldn't say all taken care of by third grade, but it will really help their social emotional aspects.
Yeah, for sure. I see with our older kids, they are at that fixed mindset, and that's that anxiety that creeps in with how they do at school, and depression, and even those acting out behaviors. And people who listen to the podcast regularly have heard me say before, it's easier to be the bad kid than to be the quote unquote dumb kid, And I think that's where a lot of those acting out behaviors stem from. So I've seen some research about the earliest you can identify dyslexia. I've seen it as young as 4.5. Do you agree with identification of dyslexia at preschool like that?
Well, so the issue is, the definition needs to change if we're really going to say that we're identifying kids, diagnosing them with dyslexia at age 4 or 5, because the definition of dyslexia is you have to have reading problems. And a lot of the times the reading problems you can identify if they're meaningfully behind other people. So if you're in kindergarten and everyone's learning to read, by definition, you're not behind, because you can't be behind because you're learning with everyone else. By the time you're meaningfully behind, say 2 years or so, then that's going to be, you have to be at least in third grade to say, okay, you'll read like a first grader. Then you can say, okay, so to be able to identify it's challenging unless the criteria is going to change, but then it's not dyslexia anymore, because if you can identify before anyone is reading, then how can you say it's reading problems? So the definition needs to change, but you can identify the risk for developing dyslexia at that age, whether it's family history, whether they're showing up in phonological awareness, phonological memory, if their language skills are behind. Also, that could add an additional component that they're more likely to have significant versions, or these environmental factors like speaking another language at home most of the time. Those kind of things could be a factor that would impact, and all these could be added to oral language abilities and vocabulary. All those could be integrated to identify risk for developing or having severe reading challenges.
I like your definition really well, especially when we think about what the definition of dyslexia is. And you're right, it's showing that this child is behind. Well, how do you demonstrate that the child is behind when they're 4.5, 5 years old from their peers? And I like that you're pulling in the family history, phonological awareness, even alphabet letter knowledge, understanding the letters of the alphabet,
Yeah.
what they are. So I think that's perfect. What are some things, again, kind of going back to the parent side, how can they identify dyslexic tendencies? Because the thing you said, I've been accused of before too, as an educator. When my kids were in school, my husband's like, you think our kids are this, you think they're this, you think they're this, because you're way involved and you see all this going on in school. And he goes, and you're over applying, is what he would tell me all the time. You're over applying. What are some ways that parents can maybe identify some difficulties with their child that have to do with dyslexia?
When they're young,
Yeah.
I think alphabet knowledge. As people talk about how you sound it out, so not saying this is A and B and C, but saying A, B, and K. So sound would be good. The letter sounds. I think phonological memory is a great one. I think the one that I remember the most from my younger son is what's the Mary Poppins song that has all this long thing that I can never remember?
Supercalifragilisticexpialidocious.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, so you don't have dyslexia. So, um, but my younger son could never say it. And I remember my older son, who doesn't have dyslexia but has ADHD, he could say it from a very young age. And then I saw him teaching him, the younger one, when they were 4 and 2, and he would try to break it up into the smallest kind of units and try to have him repeat, and he couldn't repeat it unless it was really short. And then once you start combining it together, then he completely lost the younger one. So phonological memory, so doing things like that to identify would be a good cue. And it's not diagnostic, of course, but I do think that it's pretty sensitive. And parents are very good assessors. I saw a lot of parents called me during COVID and said, I left all the education up to the schools, and I did not realize how bad my child could not read or problem X, Y, and Z until he started taking Zoom calls at home. And then I was just shocked. Is it normal? Is it abnormal? And a lot of the parents were very good at identifying the child's issue, and they should be more confident in speaking up to the teachers or sharing that with them.
I think COVID was such an eye-opening experience for so many of our parents when they would watch the Zoom calls and notice what their child was or was not doing during that Zoom. I think that was an eye-opening experience.
Oh, I agree completely that parents really know what's going on with their child. They have that instinct, and you kind of get the idea. And I also know that they have that great communication with their teachers too, or they should open up communication with their teachers if they don't already have it, because that could be totally opening up the world for that child when all the people are involved. So another thing I wanted to ask you about is ADHD and dyslexia. We know that can be a comorbid condition, but I also had another kind of twist on that question. Can dyslexia mimic ADHD tendencies?
So I think the short answer is yes, that it can. And if you look into the literature, children with ADHD report up to 40% of those with ADHD have dyslexia, and it's vice versa, the same thing. So if you take children with dyslexia, up to 40% can have ADHD, or at least that's what the current research says. Some psychiatrists use this, and I don't necessarily agree with them, but use this approach. And I'm sure some psychiatrists that I highly respect have said this, but and not a deterministic way, but almost you can tell, because if you give medication and if it works on the child, and ADHD medication, and you give it to the child, then they respond, then a physician or a child psychiatrist would say that this is almost diagnostic that they have ADHD, because otherwise it wouldn't work on them. I'm not sure if that's 100% true, but I do know that many reputable people will say that. But I do think that if the ADHD is taken care of with medication, and some parents came to me and said, first grade, they started taking ADHD medication, and it seems like their dyslexia just resolved in a day, that they were reading. And so, of course, dyslexia shouldn't resolve in a day. I mean, it'd be great if it did, but that would suggest that maybe the primary issue was more ADHD. But of course, if you have prolonged issues, unaddressed ADHD, and you can't focus in class and not paying attention to reading, then you could miss that. So that could lead to more severe reading problems also. So you could really have sort of a comorbid or co-developed condition of ADHD and dyslexia also. And then one more thing to throw in that would complicate this is that the neuronoise hypothesis that we mentioned,
Yes.
there's a neurochemical that we talk about. The excitation inhibition balance is important in the brain, and the excitation is often related to glutamate, and ADHD meds act on glutamate. So some people agree with our neuronoise hypothesis and would say that some people who have gone through anesthesia, who had this high dose and acute dose of this glutamatergic thing, would ketamine or other things, would have astonishing improvement in dyslexia, and their brain would clear out. A Harvard professor said this, emeritus, that I respect a lot. And so Al Galabrida said this, and also that he's given doses of ADHD meds to dyslexic individuals, and it's really helped their dyslexia also. So if you think about the biological noise, then ADHD meds may be acting on the dyslexia itself at some level. Also, if you believe in the neuronoise hypothesis and you believe in some of these anecdotes and how this glutamatergic system is important also for dyslexia. And there's a biological genetic link between these two processing speed, ADHD and dyslexia. So it's a little bit more complicated.
Oh, that's very interesting. And then I think as you were talking, I was also thinking about the fact that what about the parents who don't really want to put their child on ADHD medication because of the negative stigma that it's had over the past 30, 40 years. I know my sister had to take it, and my mom got worried about it because she heard one time it caused cancer. So she stopped giving it to her completely. But what about that? Like if parents could know that, there is this hypothesis, there is research that shows that ADHD medicine could help support that.
That's true. So yes, I don't know if I'm it's because I'm a psychiatrist and an MD also, but I do believe that medication, withholding that too much, is going to be counter to the child's positive outcome. I mean, if you just think about ADHD, then disruptive behavior, social, and I've seen children, and I'm sure my son also, if he's not taking medication and has social kind of issues at school because of his regulation issues, it's going to hurt his long-term relationship with his friends, even though you can't go into school and apologize and say, sorry, it was my ADHD doing it, and I'm sorry I slapped you or swore at you. And that's not going to work. Humans have these interactions, and it builds on those. So those are some important things to consider. But same for dyslexia as well, that there could be some biological mechanisms overlap, and it could potentially help the child also. I mean, you can't just go walk into a clinic and say, my child has dyslexia, can I get ADHD meds? And no one will give it to you. But if there is a good reason to take it, it could have doubly good reasons to take it.
And then does executive function also play a part into that as well?
Yes, because executive function highly linked to ADHD, also linked to dyslexia as well, because these memory components and those are related. We've identified that as a strong protective factor for those who end up having positive outcomes with dyslexia or family history who don't develop dyslexia. So definitely important to strengthen that executive function muscle, and medication could help with that also.
Wonderful. Thank you for that input.
That's interesting. Heard me say before on this podcast, 2 of my 3 kids are ADHD, not dyslexic though. As a young teacher, I used to think, if you're ADHD, you're going to be dyslexic. And then as my kids got older, I was like, nope, you don't have to be. And I can see where ADHD makes it look as if you might have a learning disability, because my kids couldn't get their things turned on time. But we knew, the teachers even knew they were intelligent. And if you asked them questions during class, they could answer it. Let's talk a little bit about the Shaywitz. So we talk about the Shaywitz quite a bit. Everybody understands overcoming dyslexia. It's been around for 20 something years, right? And they describe dyslexia as an island of weakness surrounded by a sea of strength, which I think is just a really great way to talk about dyslexia. But in your research, which is best to focus on for the weakness? Is it decoding or encoding or comprehension? But we know that our kids exist on a spectrum. So should we focus in on that individual's difficulty for remediation? Should we do all of it, decoding and encoding and comprehension? How do we support their remediation?
That's a complex question, and there's many different aspects to it, but I will just say that systematic structured literacy instruction, getting at multiple aspects of reading interventions is very important. And even if we didn't think about the strength plus weakness, so I think just focusing on decoding or phonological awareness is not going to be helpful. Most of the children would benefit from a combination of morphological awareness training, sentence more fluency training, and so on. So a combination is great for many reasons, even if you don't think about strengths. But our research and others also, but we have this nice paper from like 10 years ago on identifying all the risk factors and protective factors that people have published. So it's a summary of this. And we know that there are all these protective factors. So if you have strength in these areas, whether it's social, emotional, or more cognitive, like the executive function and so on, then, or oral language, all of these are going to protect them from developing dyslexia at all, so may never pass the threshold, or having less severe outcomes, or not having downstream consequences to reading comprehension problems and so on also. So for that reason, it's important also. And we talk about strength-based approach in all of our work and programs. And as you can intuitively imagine, being a parent, that if we worked on weaknesses and said, okay, 24 hours, let's work on your challenges and things that you hate doing the most, and is going to be very challenging. And versus if you can combine it with different things that they have confidence in, is going to have a much better outcome, social, emotionally as well. So we have a PhD training program for neurodiversity and educational neuroscience. It hasn't been canceled, but it's still funded by the National Science Foundation. And it's focused on educational neuroscience, but we have a focus on team-based work, AI, and neurodiversity. And as part of it, we prioritizing taking neurodiverse graduate students. So about half of our students each year have ADHD, dyslexia, and others. And so we really try to incorporate these strength-based approaches to our practice and teaching as well.
Great. So our audience loves when our guests talk about books or articles or websites that they think can help inform. Maybe it helps inform you, maybe it helps inform your audience that is listening, or even people who inspire you. What are some contributors in the area that you like to refer to, or anything like that?
So my books are a little too nerdy enough. I do not recommend. I write book chapters and edit some books, but it's mostly for academics. So it might not make a good Christmas present. But in terms of the websites that I like, I should have come up with some coming in. One of the websites I like is understood.org. I think it's very comprehensive. There's a lot of readers or people that go to that. And so I really like that. I don't have any financial interest in any of the things that I will say, but understood.org has a wealth of information, and they have great academics backing the research or giving little video clips behind this. The other organization that I like, and I will say that I do have conflict of interest with this one, but they're not selling anything. So there's an organization called Neurodiversity Alliance. It used to be called Eye to Eye, and they still have the Eye to Eye component embedded within the Neurodiversity Alliance. It was started by David Flink many years ago, and I loved their near peer mentoring program, and I thought it was a fantastic one, just knowing all these risk factors and protective factors and how peer input and role models are important. And that's in our 10 paper as well on risk and protective factors, or mostly about protective, social, emotional, and cognitive protective factors, a paper on that. But so we approached the Eye to Eye first, and we asked them if we could do research on their mentoring, and they said no first. They didn't say no in a not nice way, they said in the nicest way, but they said no because they had other priorities and they didn't have enough staffing to help us do this kind of research. And then I harassed them and nagged them for 2 or 3 years, and we were able to do it. And I think it was very brave of them to allow us to do a blinded sort of independent researchers come in to do research. And we found very positive results mentoring. And so now they have a club model for high school and college students. I am on the board, even though I don't have monetary gains from them, but of course, because I believe in the cause of this organization. So Neurodiversity Alliance, if you have high schoolers, college students who want to form clubs at school, they support all that. And their mentoring program, if you're middle school or high school is interested in being involved in these, it's great to have a conversation and see where you can get support to be part of that. And there might be one already near your school or near the area that you live, or you can start your own, and they really enhance your leadership skills as well by being part of this. So I do like that as well.
Perfect.
Wonderful. I will pass this along. I have several people that work at the middle and high school level that I know that would love to hear this. So thank you for that. I also wanted to ask you, this is the question I like to ask every time. If you had one wish that you could grant to the dyslexic population, what would it be and why?
So what I do want to say is that reading challenges might seem like a big deal when you're growing up or when you're first entering school, but trust that there's so many important things in life, and that you will find your passion and you will find your talent in some area that may not be in reading, but maybe in something else, and just trust and don't get bogged down by it. I'll go back to my younger son as an example. I was shocked. So until 3rd grade, he was doing intervention, and then he switched over a little bit more to writing. But then one day in 4th grade, I was asking him a question. So what's your favorite subject at school right these days? I think it was 4th grade or maybe 5th grade. And he said, writing. And I almost fell off my chair. And I thought, oh my goodness, I never thought he would bring up reading or writing or related things as something that he loves the most. And he really liked the creative aspect of it. He didn't like the mechanics of it. So I guess that will point to the second one, probably, which is keep your options open. You know, a lot of dyslexic famous people who's written books. Of course, they might have ghost writers, but we have ChatGPT, we have ghost writers, we have a lot of things that would allow you to be the clutch or support you to enhance so that you can really pursue your dreams and interests.
That's wonderful.
I love that. And I like the tie-in with your own personal experience, knowing that you have the knowledge that you have, the research that you've done, and you tie in your own personal experience makes it even more of the cherry on top, in my opinion. So thank you.
Oh, great. Thank you.
This was amazing.
It was. This was a great interview. We really appreciate you taking such a chunk of time to meet with us. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much for having me.
Yeah,
For persisting. Persistence pays off.
That's right.
I was one last ditch effort. I was like, well, let's see what happens.
I was going to, when I was in Europe, I thought, oh shoot, I need to get back because now I have time, and I'm definitely going to block off time on this one. So thank you. I was thinking about you guys before you wrote to me. So just so you know.
That's wonderful. And I was actually thinking, I would love to have you back. There's a lot more questions that I have. And I'm sure Aimee has a lot more questions too. And I know you've got a lot more answers. So maybe one day we could just have you back.
Great. Thank you.
Have to arrange it around your schedule.
Great. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So this is Aimee.
And Melissa.
And we're the
Dyslexia Duo.
We'll see you next time.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.
The Dyslexia Duo podcast hosts are Aimee Rodenroth.
Melissa Dean.
Our producer is Greg Rodenroth.
You can find us on Facebook at The Dyslexia Duo.
Email us any questions or comments at thedyslexiaduo@gmail.com.
Awareness is so important. Share this podcast with your friends,
Family,
and teachers.
thanks for joining us.
Bye.